This is the Play Your Position podcast, where we huddle up, call the plays, and inspire you to run your ball into the end zone. Are you ready to score more game-winning touchdowns in your life, business, and career? Then listen up, because it's game time, baby. Now, here's your host, Mary Lou Kaiser.
I remember when I first learned about Ernest Hemingway's daily routine. It was during a tour of his house in Key West, Florida. The tour guide told us that Hemingway would write for several hours each morning in his study, a second-floor room with tons of natural light pouring in from one of the most beautiful spots on the planet. Books jammed on bookcases lined each wall. The room looked over the sea, providing an inspirational view fit for any artist. In the center of that room was a typewriter sitting alone on top of an aging round table. After writing for several hours in the morning, Hemingway would finish up his work for the day and head out into the world again, walking down Duval Street to Sloppy Joe's, his favorite bar in Key West. Anyone looking for him would know that's where he would be, drinking himself into oblivion day after day after day. As a writer, as a creative, I could do without the bar half of my days, but the morning routine and where that morning routine took place has appealed to me since first learning about and seeing the writer's studio in the flesh. The walls in that room were a soft Caribbean blue the last time I visited the Hemingway house in Key West, which would have been in the early 2000s. Hemingway was fond of the six-toed cats that still live in Key West today. He had several of these cats who often hung around his studio, rubbing their cheeks against his typewriter as he composed his latest work of fiction or short story. His first six-toed cat came to him as a gift from a ship's captain. Its name was Snow White, and as you would expect, the cat was white all over. Today, artists and writers can spend private time in Hemingway's artist studio. For anyone who wants to jumpstart their creativity, they can arrange to spend 3 hours after the museum closes in the evening, soaking up the energy they feel inside the airy room, all for a cool $1,500. There is no guarantee that one of the six-toed descendants from Snow White will wander into the room while you are deep in your creative process, but odds are definitely in your favor. For millions of writers, Ernest Hemingway remains one of the top icons of American literature. Today, Hemingway would be classified as an A-plus asshole, a raging alcoholic suffering from mental illness, and not exactly a good history with women. The truth is, the conditions of today's world could not produce a Hemingway because he really was a product of his generation, and he represents what I call a hyper-toxic masculinity that America produced for decades in the 20th century. Things are definitely different in today's world, but toxic masculinity still exists. That brand of what it means to be a real man. It continues to play a significant part in how we think about ourselves, how we show up each day, and where we are headed culturally. And it also plays a role in self-forgiveness, which is the theme of today's episode. I just watched the latest Tiger Woods documentary on HBO, and toxic masculinity was in full display throughout that film. Tiger's father, Earl Woods, embodied it to the T. Tiger really had no chance not to take on some of the most toxic aspects of this brand of manhood that include things like coldness, compartmentalization of emotions, and chronic philandering. Tiger wasn't built like his father. Viewers could see that from early video footage that showed Tiger struggling between pleasing his dad and who he truly was inside. There was some really beautiful footage of him as a teenager, just having fun with his friends. And that was something that the life his father helped manufacture for him that just wasn't a part of his life once he became the Tiger Woods as the world knew him to be. And yet, interestingly enough, despite not being built like his father, Tiger became just like his father in a dance that only fathers and sons who are close in the way that Tiger and Earl were can partake. I was fascinated by the dynamics that existed between Tiger and his father and the way that dynamic perpetuated toxic masculinity as we know it to be today. Now, the world has changed in some ways. Certainly, toxic masculinity as embodied by men like Earl Woods and Harvey Weinstein and Roger Ailes, that kind of toxic masculinity is being called out in ways it couldn't have been in the days before social media came to town. Certainly not in Hemingway's time. And we still have a long ways to go before it's completely eradicated from the DNA pool. Believe me, that shit runs deep. It goes way back, generations deep, spanning hundreds and hundreds of years. And my point here is not to bash men. I love men. I always have. What I don't love is the toxic behavior, regardless of gender. And listen, there's toxic femininity out there as well, and way too much of it too. That needs to be eradicated as well. Yeah, the conversation here goes both ways. And today I'm focusing on these two men from very different times, men who at their core also, interestingly enough, embody the healthy sides of masculinity, things like generosity and protectiveness and showering those they love with affection and attention and showing up to do their best work. Both Ernest Hemingway and Tiger Woods struggled with demons, just like the rest of us. And again, the connection here to self-forgiveness, here's where I make it. Toxic behavior comes from not having a strong connection to your real self. It comes from being caught up in the scene, which is external. It also comes from being caught up in the expectations others have of you because of what you can do, especially when you exhibit talent in something that isn't average. And Tiger had that from a very, very young age. Hemingway was writing from a fairly young age, but he also did other things. He was a soldier. He did a lot of hunting and adventure type things. But writing was always a very big part of his life. And he set himself the goals of becoming the artist that he is now known to be. Now, sometimes that external scene and all those expectations that others have of us can lead to addiction, as both men experienced. Hemingway was an alcoholic and Tiger developed a sex addiction. And addiction of any kind is a sign that something is missing in the addict's life. And the addict is looking for temporary salvation from the pain of not having whatever it is that's not there. You know, the things that people become addicted to are easy ways of filling those holes that seem to be endless inside of people who are struggling emotionally. To move away from the unhealthy behavior toward living a full and authentic life again takes a shit ton of courage, and it also takes self-forgiveness. So what does it take to forgive yourself when you've committed an offense against you, when you've done something that is not aligned with your values or with the person you truly know yourself to be, and you're still bothered perhaps years later by not living up to that expectation you set for yourself? You know you're a better person than whatever offense you happen to commit against yourself. Again, in Tiger's case and in Hemingway's case, stepping out on their marriages, choosing destructive behavior like excessive drinking, like excessive clubbing, whatever the case may be. When you find yourself in that place, self-forgiveness has to be a part of climbing out of that toxic hole you find yourself in. And there's really two main steps. First, self-forgiveness involves making a decision to connect back to values-based living. So figuring out what really matters to you and connecting to that. And then second, self-forgiveness involves experiencing the emotional restoration of a positive sense of self. Oftentimes, people like Tiger and Hemingway have fallen into a deep pit of despair about who they are. And there isn't that, they're wrestling with who they know themselves to be truly and who they are and how they're behaving. Okay? Addicts know Addicts know that they're doing something that goes against their deepest core value, and yet they can't stop because they haven't started the process, which is far more than just forgiving themselves. But self-forgiveness is a huge, huge part of finding just baseline again. Now, there are a number of ways a person can approach the process of self-forgiveness. I want to offer a way today that I think is extremely powerful, and one that, from my vantage point, I see both Hemingway did when he was alive, and then what Tiger draws on and has drawn on in various ways over the last 15 years or so. Intentional or otherwise, there is evidence of this approach working. And the approach I'm referring to here is creating art. This is not about gender. It doesn't matter if you're male, female, or you don't identify as either. Rather, creativity and the space in which art is created. And art is a big, big word here. Okay. What I'm talking about here is the human capacity we each have for creating something out of nothing that is bigger than ourselves. For example, I consider Tiger Woods an artist and his golf game artistic because it transcends the everyday experience of the average golfer and certainly of the average human. The reason Ernest Hemingway's books and short stories have stood the test of time is because each one is a work of art, something that transcends the everyday and reflects a specific voice and a point of view that no one else has in the exact same way. And in taking it a step further, it becomes a new standard. It becomes the next benchmark for people to surpass. Art has that special something that can heal, that can touch you, the artist, deep inside. It's hard to explain, right? It's sometimes damn near impossible. It's one of those, I know it when I see it kind of situations. Hemingway did it. Agatha Christie did it. Lady Gaga does it. Jackson Pollock did it. Meryl Streep does it. These are people who are in a category all their own, who define culture because of who they are as much as for what they do or contributed to culture. And I have believed for a very long time that everyone is creative in some way, and that part of our life's journey is to discover what's creative in us. Now, sharing what we create is optional. Art does not need an audience to mean something. For many people, their art remains private. Perhaps they share it with only a small circle of trusted friends. In some cases, they don't share it with anyone, and that's okay. As part of the self-forgiveness process, art can be a catalyst to coming home again to yourself. I'm going to say that again. As part of the self-forgiveness process, art can be a catalyst to coming home again to yourself, to finding what truly matters at your core and letting go of the rest, of not sitting in judgment of yourself anymore for betraying yourself. Instead, art allows you to be in deep connection with your truest and most pure essence as a human being. It allows you to recognize that you are human, which means you're fallible, you're prone to failure, you're going to make mistakes, but you don't have to be your failure forever. Practicing art, whatever that may look like for you, is a way forward. If the art you make is only for yourself, hallelujah. Again, art doesn't need to necessarily be made public in order to qualify as art. When Tiger shows up to the practice course and hits balls for hours at a time, he does that for himself. Of course, there are probably people around who witness him practicing, and some of those people, I guarantee you, they recognize they are witnessing greatness in action, even on the practice field. Now, when Hemingway sat down in front of his typewriter, he was alone in that space of creativity. He was doing it for himself and himself only. And that's where I believe we transcend from just being average into that sphere of being artistic, is that we show up to whatever it is that we're going to create because that's what we do, because that's who we are. And we can get to that point when we do the work of forgiving ourselves for not always being true to ourselves, again, for making mistakes, for betraying our own trust. At some point, we each have to leave behind the expectations others have of us, and that includes society at large, it includes family members, it includes people we may work with. And once we've done that, we have to show up alone to the practice field, to the course, to the typewriter, to the blank page, and do what we do. We have to live our most authentic life, even if it goes against what's popular, what's on trend, what everybody else is talking about, and even if it means losing some people and things that at one time seemed to be really important. You know, self-forgiveness in a way is letting go of a part of ourselves that perhaps became familiar for a while. And that can be hard because when you get into the habit of thinking of yourself as a failure, you begin to identify with that, and to move beyond that way of thinking is a loss. And if you've done any reading at all or study of the human brain, you know that that loss is not something we like. We avoid loss at all costs, which is why some people never change, because they're unwilling to let go of who they believe they once were, and they want to just perpetuate that forever and ever. Culturally, we celebrate artists who touch us in ways that we find pleasing and acceptable and also inspirational. Now, on the flip side of that, we are also quick to cast out anyone who violates our moral code and our sense of decency. Anyone who threatens to expose our own deepest fears about ourselves is going to become the poster child for all that is wrong with being human. That's what happened to Tiger Woods when his double life first came to light. He was a hero genius one day and a ne'er-do-well in the gutter the next. And the aftermath of his fall from grace lasted for years for him. He had to do a lot of inner work on himself to get back to ground zero. Now, Ernest Hemingway also suffered a fall from grace after becoming successful, and I have air quotes around successful. I'm talking about culturally successful. He had some best-selling novels. He was making money from his art. He was popular. And after some of that early literary success, he struggled to meet the standards he'd set for himself. He had a few books that didn't do as well after his early successes. A Hemingway scholar I found named Paul Johnson wrote the following about Hemingway in his book called Intellectuals. So I'm going to read this quote. I find it ties all of what I've been talking about together in a really interesting way. So here's the quote. Hemingway created his own code based on honor, truth, and loyalty. He failed it on all three counts, and it failed him. More seriously, perhaps, he felt he was failing his art. Hemingway had many grievous faults, but there was one thing he did not lack: artistic integrity. It shines like a beacon through his whole life. He set himself the task of creating a new way of writing English and fiction, and he succeeded. It was one of the salient events in the history of our language and is now an inescapable part of it. He devoted to this task immense resources of creative skill, energy, and patience. That in itself was difficult, but far more difficult, as he discovered, was to maintain the high creative standards he had set for himself. This became apparent to him in the mid-1930s and added to his habitual depression. From then on, his few successful stories were aberrations in a long downward slide. It takes a special kind of inner strength to come back from the downward slide like Hemingway experienced, and many people never get there. In Hemingway's case, when he felt like he could never live up to the expectations he had set for himself, he struggled mightily. He drank more heavily. And it just goes to show you that forgiving yourself for failing in whatever capacity you failed takes a hell of a lot of work. And it really is paramount to the comeback. Hemingway never fully recovered from that downward slope, and unfortunately, his life ended in tragedy when he committed suicide on July 2nd, 1961. It makes me wonder if he never could reconcile within himself the disconnect between who he thought himself to be as an artist, based on what the world said he was, and who he saw himself to be. Tiger Woods, on the other hand, is different. If anyone can come back from adversity, Tiger Woods can. He has shown that to be true in the last several years as he's done the deep work on healing himself, on repairing the damage he caused to people who really loved and trusted him. And he hasn't repaired everything. That documentary shows that. He has not repaired everything. The last few years, he has risen again in the golfing ranks. He's won some big tournaments. And today, as he lies in a hospital bed recovering from multiple surgeries to the crush injuries he suffered in a single car accident yesterday, I suspect that he is drawing on that special strength deep inside himself again. I suspect that he's working on forgiving himself for being in a hurry yesterday morning and driving too fast to get to the golf course because he was running late, which resulted in what could have been a fatal end to his life. If you've seen pictures of the SUV he was driving, it is really amazing that he got out of that alive. Of course, the media is doing its job of perpetuating the story, and in a subtle way, it's perpetuating the collective judgment of Tiger Woods that this country, anyway, still has for him. I know there are people who haven't been able to get past what he did to his wife and kids when he chose to pursue what I call the clubbing lifestyle. But I do like to think that Tiger has done enough self-forgiveness work that he now knows how to enter his metaphorical artist studio, where he's composing the next page of the narrative that will become his life in the days and weeks ahead, tapping into the infinite source of possibility as he moves past this last set of mistakes and shows all of us that not only is self-forgiveness possible, but also truly the only way forward. This is Mary Lou Kaiser. Thanks so much for listening to another episode of the Play Your Position podcast. Team, be kind to yourself today. And remember, it is always a great day to get out there and play your position. See you next time.
Got a great key offensive strategy you like to share? Write to us at coach@pyppodcast.com or on Twitter, use #PYP and let us know how you're running your ball into the end zone for those game-winning touchdowns.